Hello and welcome. The following is a conversation with Bob Sturm, Associate Professor of Computer Science at the Department of Speech, Music and Hearing at KTH in Stockholm. Through his work and research, Bob specializes in the implementation of machine learning and AI applied to music data. He's also PI of MUSAiC, Music at the Frontiers of Artificial Creativity and Criticism, a project which studies how AI can transform the three interrelated music practices of listening, composition and performance, and analysis and criticism, with a focus on Irish and Swedish music. He has also started Tunes from the AI Frontiers, a blog where he documents his performances of compositions that have been generated by transformer models, the links to which will be provided in the show notes, and I truly recommend that you check them out. I was deeply honored that he agreed to participate in this conversation. I am Avid Fayaz, and this is the AI Pod. I hope that you enjoy the program. So, what is music AI, and how is it made? What are the different techniques that are used for making it?
Your question is about what is the application of artificial intelligence to music, or
no, mostly about how do we create music through AI? What are the current techniques? Is it through machine learning at the moment? Is it through deep learning?
Okay, I see. The creation of music can happen many ways. In one sense, it's picking up an instrument and exploring the instrument itself, how the body responds to the instrument, how the instrument responds to the space in which you're playing, improvisation, or exploring these things. Or it may be the creation of music might involve a piece, a pre-composed piece, or there's the statement. The underlying fact here is that music can be created in many ways, and the involvement of machines is just one way of assembling material or interacting with material to participate in this cultural activity. I want to draw a distinction between music as a product and music as an object and music as an activity. The application of machines to music or art creation is nothing new. It's been happening for many years. And in one sense, you can see just the machine as a tool, a technology, much the way that oil, in the use of oil as a medium for suspending pigment to apply to a canvas, was a tool, it was a technology. And that kind of technology allowed for new effects to be created on the canvas, let's say. A computer, a statistical machine, looking up items in a table, rolling dice, the creation of complex machine learning models, and these can all be ways to create material for this cultural activity called music.
But so your description of it is it's more of a tool at the current status.
It's a tool, yes. It's a tool in much the same way that other technologies have come and made things possible in other realms of artistic practice. So I think there's a subtext to your question, in that we live in a time where the reach of this technology is becoming such that we are cautious, or maybe a bit pessimistic or frightened of the implications of this kind of technology. One being the redundancy of humans, for instance, or in other words, the lack of employment, the automation of labor. there's many issues here that are interesting on top of the underlying technologies that are applied, or these technologies that are oftentimes reinvented and applied in a context where data has increased an enormous amount, computation accessibility has increased, efficiency of algorithms have increased, and the global connectedness of people and things that such that you can create a 24-hour Twitch stream of automatically generated music, or in a recent case, Seinfeld episodes or Seinfeld-like episodes where, you know, one machine learning system is being used to generate texts that is then read by voice models of actors, and you know, these interesting applications of generative algorithms. I think this is I'm just thinking aloud here in terms of all of the kinds of subtexts. When somebody asks, you know, what is AI music? There's many ways to answer that.
But wouldn't you say, or at least especially in deep learning techniques, that perhaps the piano is playing itself without the pianist? I mean, isn't it, you describe it as a tool perhaps for artists to create music at this stage, but aren't we moving towards a path where these devices can create music just on their own?
We've been there for many, many years. There's a kind of piano called a disc clavier that's created by Yamaha, and this is a real piano by the looks of it, but internally it has machinery that it can play itself. This is like the player piano technology from, you know, the early 20th century.
No, I mean, not necessarily in terms of automata, because another example of that...
Excuse me.
Absolutely. Another example of that was this some sort of a hurdy-gurdy type of a machine that played 3 violins at the same time. But, I mean, more in terms of the composition itself, aren't we moving towards a state where what we have as input is not necessarily the core of what is being created? The deep learning machine is itself just creating this type of music just by a very short request that we have towards it.
It's been that way for many many years. You mentioned the dice game, this approach to generating something that sounds like romantic piano music by rolling a die and assembling measures, precomposed measures based on the outcome of the die. This is, in some sense, a very simple technique to create music, create a script by which music can be played.
So for those listeners that don't know, just the dice game were a series of different dice games created by, amongst others, Amadeus Mozart, of different compositions that were put together as some sort of a game, and one would roll 2 dice and create some sort of a waltz. And I read Mozart's own instructions about this, which I found to be very amusing, which is instructions for the composition of as many waltzes as one desires with dice without understanding anything about music and composition. So it is a pathway even at that dice game stage towards creating music, but in that level it's just a randomness that you throw 2 dice. But at this level it's a prompt that the user might be giving to create a very specific type of music.
Preceding that, there was a procedure, or invented several procedures for generating music for liturgical contexts. So this arca MUSArithmica was sort of designed. This is a box with pegs in it, or tablets, that provide instructions for composing church-like music. This was invented in the 17th century, early 17th century, and can create an endless variety of sort of music for liturgical context, for religious ceremonies. And this precedes the musical dice game by, a century or more. And it's interesting to reflect on a more popular application of this music generation, which is creating waltzes, and an arguably secular and a religious context, where again the arca musarithmica, in some sense, was billed for people who didn't have the understanding of counterpoint or harmony to construct this material. But an interesting aspect of that is that the author or the creator of this seemed to have the perspective that the output of this approach, this algorithm, it wasn't a machine, it was a box of tablets that you, by instructions, assemble, creates raw materials that need refinement by somebody who knows about music. And so it got you the outline of a piece, let's say, that could then be improved upon by somebody who knew what they were doing to prepare it for performance.
But that's basically, to a certain degree, my question is that is there a need for the musician? Is there a need for the composer that creates this game with many different compositions? Mm-hmm. At the current level, there is no need perhaps anymore for anyone to really understand the music.
Mm. And that gets at the heart of the claim that I want to dispel, that music is a product, that music is the sheet of music that has notes or dots on it, that music is the recording on a CD or a download from Bandcamp. That's that's a really restricted way to view music. Music is an activity. It's a cultural activity. It involves a person engaging with the history of what they've heard in the past, and perhaps communicating some message or communicating some emotion that is not easily described by words. It's not the recording, though, that is the music here. And so people mistake the music for the product, and then it's very easy to see. Machine can produce the product too. The machine can produce the product at a cheaper cost than the human. Therefore, we'd have no need for human. But music, when you see it as an activity, as a cultural activity that people share, you can't divorce the human from that. The human is, say, augmented but with the machine. The human is augmented with software that allows them to create sheet music, that allows them to master recordings on their own, to submit to Bandcamp, to develop a following. But the music is what happens around what we see as the product. And with that richer perspective of music as an activity, you can see the machine as a tool, as a, maybe in some sense, a co-creator. It's much more like, these tools are becoming much more than just a word processor, right? You have Microsoft buying ChatGPT to integrate this within the Word words, or whatever application they're creating. And I don't know if you've used ChatGPT yet, but it's a very, it's a tool that can be applied in a diverse number of situations, where when you're working with it, when I'm working with it, it becomes much more of a co-creator than a word processor, let's say. So these AI systems that are being trained on lots of music, they're becoming partners in the creation of music, which is at the core a human activity. Now, considering the current states of the world in the sense of capitalism and the neoliberalist perspective that profits and making money is sort of the goal, that things that make money are good and things that don't return a profit are not desirable, it's easy to see that in some contexts where music is needed for commercials, for selling things, that the desire is to reduce the amount of money needed to market a product and thus increase revenue and profit. And in this sense, there's a threat to a musician's ability to earn money doing tasks that they used to earn money for. They have to take on many more, say, freelance jobs in order to make ends meet now, because some companies are employing algorithms now to create hundreds of thousands of hours of production music that is high quality, enough quality that it is quite quickly applicable to a commercial, that it is threatening the livelihood of composers that would make their money otherwise. So, two different perspectives here. I can say, music is a cultural activity, don't worry. AI is just a tool, it's a partner in music creation, but the human is always a part of it. But there's the other perspective, is that there's a real need for music as a product, and this is where the application of these technologies, some people call it democratizing, that now you don't need to hire a team of artists to do branding. Let's say you can do it yourself by interfacing with ChatGPT, Stable Diffusion, Music LM, maybe you've seen this recently. And then this will get you most of the way there at a far cheaper price. And then we have a lot of people that can't make ends meet to practice their art. So what is the solution then? Well, in my opinion, society needs to step up and put a value on art as an essential part of being a human being in some country, in some place. Whether that's a universal income, whether that's government subsidized cultural activities. Like in Sweden, there's some support to subsidize choreographers and playwrights and musicians who are actually trying to be full-time artists. There's fellowships, there's grants. Artists, though, it becomes, there's a lot of solutions out there, but society as a whole, whether it's within a nation or within a global community, needs to move beyond trying to pay the least amount of money for a product, right? A lot of people expect to get music for free. They pay a subscription to Spotify or Netflix and they get all this content for free. You have people that don't want to pay for these big corporations that control the media, and so you got piracy and whatnot. But really, we are trying to get away with not paying the true cost of things. I think it's a core problem of a society that's steeped in sort of capitalistic neoliberal tendencies.
You raise quite a very many complex problems there. But if we begin unwinding them one by one, let's begin with perhaps the democratization of music. I remember in an interview with a relatively young Kanye West before all the anti-Semitism, he was talking about how a digital drum set had provided a tool for him to create, as he called it, dope music. Whereas otherwise he would have not had any access to all these different sounds that he was able to put together with just this digital drum set. So from that perspective, I think that there's definitely a case for people that normally don't have access to any real tools to create music, as they are very expensive, or can be at least. And that is a very beautiful thing, I think. That's people, I think everyone has some sound, some melody in their mind, and perhaps these tools are the best way to produce them and bring them out. But from another perspective, one could say, and we see it now with ChatGPT, this is a really good, relatively good programmer, as a programmer, as we discuss our role in the society of the future, the fact that one might no longer need to learn a musical instrument or need to learn programming. The pain of having to learn how to stroke a violin is something that is in itself perhaps part of the musical training, don't you think? That perhaps that part of that romantic part of having to go through the grind of it is something that might be disappearing with this.
Kind of. I think that there's a lot of things to address here. First of all, democratization. This is a word that is used quite often by companies and tool developers providing these services without thinking about what does it mean democratization. This is referring to democracy, which is kind of a form of government in which votes are held, a majority, the decision of the majority gets its way. Where's the voting in this the marketplace in which these tools are supposed to be democratizing things? I think what is meant instead of democratization is a reduction of the cost of access, maybe, to this technology that becomes available to more people. Although, to use these kinds of technologies requires electricity, requires a computer with a sufficient amount of power, connectivity to the internet, some literacy in terms of how to work with a computer, right? Like my parents, it took a couple lessons to teach them how to use a mouse. What is a mouse? And then a trackpad. Now that was weird. So I think, so democratization and accessibility, increasing accessibility. When I also mentioned earlier about people are not willing to pay the true price of things, it's not just out of the wallet. It's also out of the labor that's required to appreciate something or to develop an understanding. And this is another aspect of neoliberalism that I find abhorrent to my profession as an educator, as a person that is teaching at a higher institution. In some sense, the institution is a business, the university, KTH, and it's seeking to, with great government subsidy, be self-sustaining, let's say, to bring in money from corporate collaborations, government grants, etc. A neoliberal perspective of education is that the job at the end of the production line is the justification for one's education. If you don't get a job in what you've been educated in and you're not making money, then that education was not worth it. And I find that perspective quite narrow, and it doesn't account for the real purpose of education, which is to make someone to help someone become a productive member of society that can think critically, be able to weigh evidence and form educated opinions, to participate in society in a way that is in the interest of the public good. It's not about the job at the end of the line. In music, it's kind of the same. You have to become an accomplished pianist. You have to put in the time to understand the interaction with the body and the piano, to understand the vocabulary, the mechanics. This time is not, in a sense, justified by playing in Carnegie Hall in 20 years' time, but through the procedure of interacting with the instrument, with interacting with the quote, language, the syntax of music, you develop an appreciation for, or an embodiment of being with the instrument physically. I started on this, as a personal story, I started on this path of AI music generation in 2015, applying some basic language modeling to textual representations of Irish traditional music transcriptions. At the time, I really didn't have a true understanding of what this data encompassed. I knew there was lots of data. I knew I had heard Irish traditional music performed before, and I could play some on an accordion, what have you. But it wasn't until a few years later that I started to think, all right, I need to build up an appreciation for this data. Where does this data come from? what are the dynamics at play in the collection of this data and providing it online, sharing it, playing it with others, etc. So I started to take accordion lessons with a teacher who comes from a particular region in Ireland that was online during the pandemic. We started during the pandemic. And this was really the first time in my life that I was devoting a significant amount of my time to playing my instrument. Now, the accordion is, something it's very physical, right? It's like this lung that you play. You've got buttons. You're not able to look at the buttons to look where your hands are on either side. You've got bass buttons on the left-hand side. You've got to breathe. This particular kind of instrument has a different note, push-pull, so my fingers may not change position, but if I push or pull the air out or in of the instrument, the pitch changes, which is very strange at first. But after spending, a couple thousand hours on this instrument, I started to really understand the physical connection with the instrument and what's required in order to produce particular sounds, ornaments that is acceptable within traditional Irish music in a particular region. Maybe it's unacceptable in another particular region of Ireland. But through this time, all this time that I spent playing and gaining an appreciation, it's not the end result that's the goal. It's that whole path that gives me an appreciation for listening to myself, approaching a new tune, listening to another performer play on that same instrument, listening to another performer play on a different instrument. I mean, it's an incredible amount of work that's necessary. So now we have AI systems like Performance RNN or Music Transformer, which can generate realistic sounding, human-like piano music, novel performed piano music. And again, with this neoliberal position, we don't need the human musician, we don't need the human composer, we don't even need the mastering engineer in the recording studio because these are all automated. We can get to where we think we want, with a minimum amount of cost, which is good for certain sectors.
Well, I don't think, the first question is, I don't, so far as I know, that these devices can create music and play it in such a manner that it has different types of interpretation, but it's not necessarily something of their own. It's perhaps a mashup of different replications. So when I listen to Daniel Barenboim play the piano and Marta Argerich play the piano, the style of playing has these differences. That is perhaps why, as a listener, you go and pay to watch them at a live concert. And indeed, one could say, as you say, different sectors have different goals and ends to means, and that's perhaps classical music is the last bastion that might never necessarily fall, because it's very much about these very fine and small details of interpretation. But in pop music, it's very much more open to watered down versions of music. And we have seen it to a certain degree, with the current state of the more pop cultural music, but also in the creation of new films by companies like Netflix that are very algorithm driven. So many critics say that they basically just try to pander to the algorithm and just create that which already works, but don't move towards a more creative paths, and don't want to even do that.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think popular music, rock, and all these forms of music that have a widespread appeal are more complicated than they're given, than they're assumed to be. Yes, in classical music, in modern classical music, you have a wide variety of different systems at play. And it's, the conservatory as an educational institution, can be a bit conservative in the sense of not allowing popular music outside of maybe a small class. But the real music is, modern classical music. It involves, particular signs and signals that a composer has enveloped an appreciation for practice over the past, 10, 20 years, and can speak about their composition in relation to these works. Popular music is seen to be vulgar and not very creative, or pandering to the masses, pandering to the algorithm, perhaps. But I think it's more complex than that. Popular music is actually one area where artificial intelligence is being explored a lot. And with efforts like the AI Song Contest over the past 3 years, you can see a growing interest in applying artificial intelligence to popular music. In my domain of folk music, there's similar condescension towards it. Folk music is seen as an unserious kind of music of uneducated people, let's say, and that's really an awful stereotype that is dispelled once you start to get into the nitty-gritty details of why people play this particular music the way they do on the instruments that they do, and it's a very intriguing history. Folk music isn't as attractive as a sandbox to apply AI than pop music. Classical music, you have some people exploring artificial intelligence as well. And actually, in classical contexts, the application of computer technology to music was, a pioneering area in the 50s and 60s and before then. So there's a lot of assumptions that go into conversations about applying music to AI. Music as a product, redundancy of humans, the idea of reducing a human to just producing an audio recording from a score on an instrument that they play. It's not an accurate description of what a musician does, or that the purpose of their training is in order to enable that product. But we're in a constant dialogue with our world. And you had mentioned earlier the existence of these tools lowers the bar for people to create music. And some people say, isn't it wonderful everyone can create music now? All these tools are available. Other people say, why should everyone be able to create music? Right? I have a friend who says, why should I listen to music created by anybody? Should a person be allowed to create music in some sense? I mean, that's quite a pessimistic view, in my opinion. But we've been surrounded by the capacity to create music for a long time. We don't need technology to do that. But string a rubber band around a Tupperware or around a yogurt, container, and you have a little instrument. You can make a whistle from a straw. There's lots of ways that you can repurpose tools in the kitchen for musical purposes, right? And it's not about creating a hit or making money on the music. It's about interacting with your sonic environment, with the elements of rhythm and pitch and maybe contrast, timbres, different timbres. As a group, exploring, responding to each other without the use of words. Right? Music can be a huge, wide variety of things.
I mean, to your friend, one might answer basically that there are many people that don't have access to that type of training that many receive at a very early childhood, but also have this musical mindset that they're now able to release it with. But a bigger question is perhaps, are these artificial intelligence music creating devices capable of creating new genres of music. I mean, I won't start necessarily going too deep on the magnificence of Beethoven, but beyond the starting of the Romantic era and being one of the pioneers of the Romantic era, he has this little obscure piece named the Große Fugue. And Igor Stravinsky once described it as it's contemporary and it will always be contemporary. And if anyone who does not necessarily know it's a Beethoven piece listens to it, it truly sounds like a piece of modern music. Mm-hmm. And to think that there existed these type of human beings that could create music that had never been heard before is something that is quite extraordinary. Maybe another composer of our time that kind of creates new sounds. A lot of it is going in the movie industry, but Hans Zimmer, for example, is someone that creates new sounds in music that have not necessarily been heard before. Are the current techniques capable of creating sounds that are new to us? Are they capable of creating new genres?
Okay, so the first part is, are they capable of creating new sounds that we've never heard before? Yes, and that's not news. This has been the ability of synthesis engines, computer synthesis technology for many years, since the 50s, with particular labs like Bell Labs in the US, with Max Matthews' music language for programming computers to synthesize sound, to John Chowning's frequency modulation synthesis, which was a very successful, commercially successful synthesis technology that allowed one to create realistic sounding brass and strings, to physical modeling synthesis, where you can model the string, bridge, body physics and make it sound like a string, but you can also change the density of the string. You can make the string as long as a bridge, and see what it would sound like plucked, right? Plucked really hard, or struck with a hammer, or struck with something. So you can create sounds that you've never heard before very easily. You don't need artificial intelligence to do that. But modern day technology, the hype is AI. You have the DDSP approach, differentiable digital signal processing approach, that allows one to construct a neural model of an instrument timbre, and this is using additive synthesis techniques that have been around for dozens of years to generate sounds that can be in between two instruments or what have you. All of this technology has existed for a long time. Now, creating new genres. I don't know what you mean by genre, but I think you mean like music style. Or you go into you'd go into a record store and there'd be, no, there still exist record stores today. There's blues, there's jazz, there's rock, there's electronica. Maybe you see within rock, you see punk, and you see all these other things that you can then search through. So I think you mean style, but genre is a very complicated term that involves rules and value systems and things that are far outside of the actual object that you're talking about. It involves people's relationships to those objects and how they speak about them. Can these systems create new genres of music, or new styles of music? We'll wait and see how long these kinds of languages or these styles stick around. But again, I can say that this has already appeared, and without any kind of technology. Well, I mean, you have John Cage, a composer, an American composer, laying sheet music onto star maps, or vice versa, star maps onto sheet music, and then poking holes through the random distribution of stars on these star maps. And then you lift up the star map, and there you have the notes to be played in the composition. Music no one's ever heard before. right? Or using the I Ching to decide what notes get played where. This is aleatoric music. Aleatoric music is a style that has been around and is used as a device, a musical device in compositions today. And then, before that you had musique concrète, where recordings of sound, pieces of tape would be spliced together. And you have another John Cage composition is Williams Mix, which says, 5 seconds of sound from a cityscape, 3 seconds of sound from a public pool, 10 seconds of sound from a busy highway. And it gives instructions for composing a piece of tape music from, a collection, archive of recordings from these different environments. New sounds, new music no one's ever heard of. And even before then, you had Georges Antheil, an American composer, involving machines and car horns and boat horns in a composition. I think it's called Ballet Mécanique. And, one of the earliest pieces involving these machines, these car horns, and creating these pieces of music. No, it's academic. It's not popular music. No one's singing Ballet Mécanique. But it's, again, the involvement of technology and machines for creating sounds no one ever heard of in that context. AI is no different.
And would you say that these... it's a very interesting thought to say that AI is not necessarily any different from the others, but would you say it's relatively Western focused, this type of, these AIs that create music?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
absolutely, there is a tendency of engineers in this area, or in many areas, to choose what is convenient, let's say, not what is relevant. Because we have the internet, we've got lots of data available. A lot of MIDI files are hosted on websites, and you can scrape this MIDI, and a lot of it is popular music from Europe and the US and the United Kingdom. And because of that, because somebody has gone to the effort of hand labeling, chords or harmonic progressions in the Beatles data set, that data is available, and because of its convenience, the system is built using that data, using orchestral music from European composers. It's difficult to read web pages that are in Chinese because I don't speak Chinese, but there's a lot of music, folk music and orchestral music, orchestral music, that's a whole totally different thing. Peking opera, Beijing opera, that's not really accessible because I can't read it and I don't know how to search for it. So indeed, a lot of the music is in a format today that is heavily focused on Western practices, Western popular practices, and even in classical music, Western approaches to music composition. So yes, there is a high amount of overrepresentation of the music culture of one particular place over others, just because of the convenience of the data. There are efforts to combat that. So in music informatics, my domain, where it's basically trying to create the Google for music, let's say, to make the content in audio data or in sheet music or whatever accessible and rich with meaning for musicologists or people looking for particular songs or data. There are efforts to enrich music informatics research with non-Western approaches, such as classical Indian music and those practices. And over the past 10 years, they've been relatively successful in bringing into the fold music from, music is practiced in the Middle East, music is practiced in the Far East, in the global South. Africa still has some ways to come into the fold in this research domain, but efforts are underway to even bring practices in Africa to the research field.
But isn't it? I think it's very. My parents are involved in traditional Persian music, and the challenge there, as someone who's personally, I've been more trained on the more European style of music, but in traditional Persian music, it's very much not necessarily based on the written type of music. It's more about improvisation within different styles and, as they're called, different corners of the music. So this Western style of writing music, which we use basically as an alphabet we have for it, if you have to go through the more English version, it's ABCs. In the Italian version, it's Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Si. It's very convenient to create a system that basically reads it like it's, to a certain degree, reading a text, whereas in other forms of music from other cultures, it can be a completely different system.
Yep.
And how do you face that challenge, basically?
Yep. So this is another point, another reason why a lot of research in this area has focused on the convenient. With Western practices, you have this standardized notation, and it's somewhat logical in the sense of you have a staff, you've got a designation of pitches. These map to MIDI notes. MIDI, there's a lot of MIDI data. You've got volume, you've got measure lines, whatever, meter, keys. But in other kinds of music where the notation is foreign, a completely strange concept, you don't notate. You have a sort of a tonal center or an idea that you improvise around. And it's the same in classical Indian music, quite different. You don't notate it. It's funny, in Irish traditional music, you don't notate. Notation is seen as sort of a necessary evil. It's a way to preserve maybe a tune and as a crib sheet. But when you learn the music, you don't learn by reading it. You learn by imitating your teacher. And they play it, they play a phrase, and you repeat, and you work on the rhythm, you work on the ornamentation. And there are some very strange things that happen with Irish traditional music that don't appear in the score or any kind of score, any kind of representation. And in order to understand that, you have to learn this traditional way, and you have to play for a dancer, because the music is meant for dancing. When you play with a dancer, when you play together, you have sort of different rhythms at play. Even the, in some places in Ireland, the C and the C sharp are treated as the same, and sometimes a fiddle player will play in between them. And it makes such a sound that my classically trained wife, who plays classical flute, thinks that the musician is a very bad musician, because they're playing this pitch that sounds awful to her. But it's actually intentional to produce this kind of sound. I can't do it on the accordion because you have a fixed grid of pitches. So it's inaccessible to me. And one famous Irish musician, for that reason, said the accordion is a horrible instrument for Irish traditional music. But now the Irish accordion is like quintessential. But for these other kinds of music, you have something that's completely different, that you need to rethink the entire architecture of machine learning, because you're not working on sequences, you're working on musical ideas and the development of these ideas, the quotation and turning them around and playing with rhythm in addition to the pitch material, and there's lyrics sometimes, there's dancing involved. It's quite a challenge for somebody who just wants to create a machine learning system to generate music. And that's one of my big flags that one of my big protest signs, let's say, in this domain. So if you want to apply AI to music, that's fine. But if you want to do it in a meaningful way, you need to work with practitioners to understand the context of the music, the practice of the music, to understand what is accessible to your machine and what isn't accessible to the machine. Develop appropriate limitations for, the evaluation of the machine in the context of music making. We can look at loss curves, we can look at validation set, all these things, but it doesn't give you an indication of the actual usefulness of your system in the context, or the success of the system in the context. And it certainly doesn't give you ideas of how to move your system beyond just creating symbols into becoming a participant in the music creation process. That's why I think that, you know, these systems, some create fine music for commercials and what have you, reducing the cost. But for me, when I use these systems, it's creating raw materials that I then assemble, I curate from, and I sort of interact with the tradition through curating from these materials generated by my little machine, learning to play them, changing them, adapting them, making them my own, and then sharing them with colleagues of mine that also play instruments.
And the thing about that is, we talk about types of music that are not necessarily as popular or well recorded as many others. And you work on your personal blog with preserving Irish traditional music from certain areas, and can you create with your machines those tiny elements that are completely beyond the scope of traditional Western music, and have those elements that make it be have its unique element to it? Preserve those as well, or bring them back to life?
I think you're asking, can the machine really be novel or creative?
Well, not necessarily novel, but there are elements in certain types of music that have this. There is this human element to it. That's when a music is dying, when the number of players are becoming fewer and fewer, it becomes very hard to preserve that factor. That's tiny, playful elements in the creation of that music. Can machines that are trying to preserve music be tuned so as to create those playful little notches through it?
I don't think any machine is trained to preserve music. I think the machine, like my machine, full clarinet, trained on Irish traditional music, trained on Swedish traditional music, say it's not an aim to preserve music. What is it? Well, it's a product of research looking at how representation can be. It can impact the music generation process. It's also a study in how a machine might become a co-creative partner in traditional music. It's also looking at how such a machine provides another way to engage with the tradition. It's in no way a preservation or even a representation of the music as practiced by the community, as practiced by students of learning from their teacher, etc. It's a trick. It's a parlor trick that is a very fancy statistical machine that can put together sequences that, when interpreted by a real person or somebody who can understand, who's trained in the tradition, can be played in such a way that people would be fooled into thinking that this is a real traditional tune. But it goes beyond that. The system can do things that are quite unlike what you find in the tradition. And in some cases, these mistakes are of such a kind or such a type that a person from the traditions could say, I don't know of any tune that does that little figure, and I wonder why there has been no tune that does that little figure, because it completely fits within the language, the syntax of the tradition. So that's, in a sense, a mistake of the system to have created something that is unlike anything that is in the corpus that it's been trained on, but it's a success of the system in that it has created something new that an expert in the tradition says, I don't know why, I don't know of any tune that does that, but it should. It's completely appropriate. And of course, there are other outputs of the system that create things that are failures, total failures. Don't resemble at all Irish traditional music or Swedish traditional music, sometimes the failures are charming. As a as a composer, I want to work with those failures and sort of explore what went wrong and how to bring it within my language, let's say. And then there's others just sort of trash. Like there's nothing interesting, noteworthy about this output of the system, that it's just totally forgettable. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, that's perhaps the most fascinating part about it, that it goes beyond the corpus that it has been trained on.
Mm-hmm.
And one could look at that and say it's a mistake, but also one could say it's perhaps a new thing that is being created.
And that's the thing that you see time and time again when you give people, creative people, tools, that they use them in ways never intended. They find ways to break the system and exploit those interesting behaviors that result. My colleague Oded Bental is a composer, and he's been working with me on this research for a while, since I started, basically. He wrote a piece exploring this breaking of the system. And so within the Folkharden system, you have a parameter called temperature, which controls the adventurousness of the sampling at the end. So as you increase temperature, the probability of making a strange choice of a symbol becomes larger and larger. As you decrease it, the system becomes more conservative and will just start to repeat itself in a conservative fashion, like arpeggiating some chord. So he, in one movement of the work, he generated some stuff, and then he generated some stuff with the temperature increased. And then he increased the temperature again, generated, increased again, generated. And you could see through the timeline of this movement of his work, the system become crazier and crazier with its sort of musical language. But crazier in a sense that most of what it had generated for him was he discarded. And he was heavily curating the outputs. He's a composer. And he had a particular vision of how this movement would go. But it was exploring the eventual breaking of the system that became this idea of the movement. And you see that. You see people misusing systems like the 303 synthesizer, which was meant to create rhythm tracks for people to practice jazz or what have you. And then it became, somebody found it at a thrift store, and it became the item to make an acid dance track, right? With the twisting the knobs and making these crazy sounds. Total misuse of the rhythm system, the accompaniment system, but one that led to the creation of a whole style of music and a whole practice of music. And you have circuit bending. Do you know about this?
Yes. But please say.
I mean, circuit bending, where you take a electronic toy and you sort of perform a lobotomy on it. You dissect it. You connect things at random in the circuitry, and you create all sorts of weird sounds that are then used as in a performance or in a creative context. Total misapplication or misuse of the technology to create something new. And it's the same way with artists and AI. You have prompt engineering today with stable diffusion. If you add to certain terms like trending on ArtStation and high resolution and other things, you get these different effects. And so this stable diffusion isn't just a way to create a raccoon eating a taco on a spaceship, but you can bend the circuitry in the system by adding all these other descriptors that make it oriented in the latent space to bring about these effects at the output of the image.
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's a sense of really artistic beauty to the idea of a device being created and some others just taking that device and testing it and bringing out something that the creators themselves had never anticipated the device would be able to do. However, there are those, especially in the visual arts at the current moment, with OpenAI's DALL-E 2, that put into question perhaps one could say it's slightly because they fear their jobs might be in threat. But there have been many artists that have been saying what DALL-E creates is in no way whatsoever art.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that? I mean, do you think that these devices are creating art, or are they just replicators? And I think what we discussed is an indicator that it's not exactly that. But where do you think, why are so many artists critical of these devices?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a danger here in equating art with the product. Again, like music, equating music with the product that comes out of it. There's also a distinction that might be drawn between art and craft. There's a recognition that in the media industry you have people that are paid to create storyboards, to create mock-ups, to do branding, illustration. These are people that have, developed a professional practice of translating the needs of a customer into the look of, let's say, a package for medicine, or a label on a wine bottle, or illustration in a New Yorker article. And then, that's one thing, but then you have other practitioners who are creating works for museums, for private collectors. You have these totally different realms, and you can't call all of the people that are participating in these artists, right? Much the way you might not call everyone who plays an instrument a musician. I mean, why not call everyone who plays an instrument a musician?
That becomes the question of what an artist is, which is a very complex one, but yeah, I completely agree.
Again, what a musician is, you can see it in the neoliberal framework that it's someone who creates recordings, or someone who plays at a concert. An artist is someone, image artist, a tangible medium, someone who creates a sculpture, someone who creates a painting for hanging up in a gallery, a tangible item. An artist also may illustrate a story, illustrate a children's book, create a mock-up for a commercial. And it could be very broad. But again, art and being an artist is not just creating that product, but it is interacting with one's environment, cultural environment, social environment, economic system, political system, translating an experience or a sense into something that can be sensed in another way. So I think what I'm saying is that there's a lot of weight that can be given to the impact of stable diffusion, or the impact of DALL-E, or these systems that appear to make redundant humans for creating these. We might as well we are going to hire prompt engineers now for our arts teams and use the stable diffusion engine. Yeah, that's probably going to be true in some industries, but that doesn't mean art ends. Again, going back to a point a while ago of society needs to make a decision to pay the true cost of things and to recognize a value in culture and a value in renewing culture as we proceed through this timeline of, political systems and war and strife and joy, etc., and the pandemics and what have you. We're responding to our time and the situations we find ourselves in, and that's not going to be replaced by a system completely divorced from the experience of being human. It's a rather human-centered view. I mean, we can go post-human view and say, the experience of other things like a space or an animal or, a tree, translate that into other experiences. Broad perspectives here.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of this, it's just that such things as music are human-centric. We cannot take away the human from them.
That's right. It's a human activity.
So there might indeed, many things might be one day automated, but I don't really think there's going to be. You cannot really pull away the human from the whole of it. Although I do think to myself, will we one day be going to a Carnegie Hall concert that is completely composed by AI or not?
Completely composed. What does that mean?
Well, it's of course maybe there is a need for a prompt to be written to make a composition, but to an AI. But at the end, it has created the whole of the composition. If you tell it, write a symphony for me, and it writes a symphony for movements, and you go and watch it. But will we? Do we? Are we so egocentric about our love of ourselves as humans that we might say, "I'm not gonna go and watch what a computer has come up with"?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean. In terms of research questions, you see people in the past 20, 30 years writing algorithms trying to build a system that can write Bach-like chorales and completing Beethoven's 10th Symphony, completing Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, completing Mahler's 10th Symphony, whatever, with these machines. And all of the media that comes from these kinds of headlines, right? If we generate an algorithm that can compose a 4-movement symphony in the style of Beethoven, what's the value in that? Do we need Bach chorales? Is there a need for Bach chorales? We have modern styles of vocal writing that are creating totally different sound worlds than the approach that Bach would take, or people of his time. Why are we spending so much effort imitating practices that are, in some sense, totally explored? Right? Are there still rules of 4-part voice leading that have yet to be discovered? In some sense, writing a Bach chorale can be a demonstration of the success of an algorithm for learning the rules from a data set and what have you. But at the end of the day, the application that would be more interesting is to misuse it in creating new things. And so with the folk RNN system, I'm totally uninterested in creating the best reel or the best double jig. I'm totally uninterested in fooling people into believing something AI generated was human generated. It comes from the tradition. It's a lost tune. I'm much more interested in the use of this system for expressing my experience, day-to-day experience as a professor in Sweden with a family, let's say, and my dog is a subject to several of my pieces, giving life to these artificially created tunes and translated in my own voice. Right? Using this system to create something new rather than to imitate what I've learned in Ireland.
It's something to think about, really. But if we move to the ethics of it, do you think, are there any sorts of music that shouldn't be created by AI? There was this rapper, FN Mecca, that was basically trained on corpuses of gangbang rap, and it promoted very offensive things that perhaps are not necessarily very alien to that sort of rap, but immediately it caused a lot of controversy because it wasn't a real person saying those things. It was a computer that was trained on real people saying those things. Do you think there are, as a developer and as an artist, do you see problems in creating certain sorts of music?
Oh, there's a whole host of interesting and necessary questions of ethics in any application of machine learning, any development of technology, really. This requires reflection in a constant way, and it's not satisfying from an engineering perspective to not have a derivation and a clear point by point set of rules to follow. That you should not do this, you should not do that, do not apply your algorithm to this. That's not applicable. That doesn't happen in ethics. Ethics is a conversation. It's a constant reevaluation of one's values, of one's assumptions. Ethics is about what is good, what is bad, and how do we know. And there are a variety of frameworks that one can use to talk about these things. Yeah, I mean, I've written a bit about ethics of AI in music, and there's far more questions than answers in these writings. So in some sense, it's very unsatisfying to not find that. But it's the process of questioning, of engaging with the potential harms of a technology and responses to frictions that one would observe in a community of practitioners that see me applying algorithms to, a culture that they cherish. Let's say a collision of value systems in that sense. So we as engineers have to be careful and have to reflect upon the consequences of our actions, from the collection of the data, from the use of data found on the internet, from the deployment of systems online, making the model weights available. Reproducible research requires, you make the products of your research available, but perhaps somebody could misuse what you have created for aspects that would be offensive to entire communities. We need reflection on this.
It's always in these questions, I think that we just need discussion and not necessarily solid answers, but just
discussion and action, actually. From my reflections on the ethics of what I'm doing with applying a language model to textual representations of Irish traditional music, I developed a desire to pay penance, in a sense, to understand the frictions that were being caused by my research requires some personal sacrifice and education on my part. And so that was one of a major motivating factor in sort of stopping what I was doing and actually putting myself in the context to learn the music the way it is taught today. Read as much as I could on the history of the music and as it was practiced, many years ago. Read about the politics of Ireland, read about the politics of the music, the nationalistic aspects of the music, attend summer schools, submit myself, participating in a class with, 15 other kids, 11 years old, 12 years old, and they have a musicianship that far exceeds mine. And learning in that environment with them, learning about the stories of that this teacher learned this tune from so-and-so, and now we're going to learn it this way. And the need to reflect on what I had been doing and learn the value system that was in conflict with my engineering was necessary. And so it required reflection, but it also required action on my part. And now I feel as if I can understand where the friction comes from, and I feel like I can respond to it in ways that are convincing. In a sense that I've paid my dues. I continue to. I run an Irish music learner session here at KTH every other Sunday. We meet and learn tunes in the traditional way, and so fostering a community of enthusiasts of Irish traditional music in Stockholm, and continuing to contribute to the health of this group, even though it may be small, like 10 people, is one way of me contributing back to the tradition. And nothing about this session has anything to do with machine-generated tunes, by the way. That's completely separate. That's a totally different practice.
It's just love for music, I could say.
Yeah, it's more than that. It's
Is it preserving traditions, perhaps, as well, to a certain degree for you? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I've worked really hard on becoming sort of adept at performing the music. And if I take a break, then it starts to decay. And so in a very self-interested way, this is a means of keeping the pressure on myself to keep up my practice, let's say. But in another sense, it's a social activity that is very satisfying to play with others, to teach tunes, to play a tune well, to feel the rhythm is very satisfying. So it's like it is love of the music, but it's also an enjoyment of how it makes me feel.
And let us finish with what we started. How do you see the future of AI in music, especially when you discussed quite a lot paying the price? Will people, do you think, in the long-term future start paying the price? Or what do you see as the future of both perhaps more niche types of music and more popular types of music?
There's a great book written by a French philosopher and economist, Jacques Attali, called Noise. It was translated from French in 1977 to English. And it provides a really interesting and strange look at music as a forecast for other aspects of the world. Music, he portrays music as a, going through several stages. One being sacrifice, another being reproduction, and so on. And now we're going into this next phase, composition, where it's much less of a global enterprise and more of a local enterprise. Music is coming back to communities, in some sense, I think is the argument. The text itself is not written for engineers. It's and as a maybe budding humanist in the sense of reading more and more essays in humanism, science, technology studies, it was difficult for me to come to grasp with what Attali was trying to say. But I think the future of music holds that it's going to be more and more focused in the local community, I would say. You're still going to have concerts, you're still going to have musicians, you're still going to have composition. But it's going to be, whatever it is, it's going to proceed. AI is not going to take this away from us.
Yeah, I mean, from a developer's perspective, I think that we have to start moving towards a more humanistic approach towards our work as well, and think about not just the technical aspects of it, but both the logical and emotional impacts of it, more as it's becoming something that affects almost every element of our lives. But I think that if one thing will continue to exist after the automation continues to expand through these AI models, is art and music. It's a very interesting thing to think about.
And the automation is going to be automated as well.
Exactly. But I would say now, thank you very much for participating in this podcast.
My pleasure. I hope I didn't run on. I mean, My thinking process is completely non-linear, and it's
No, I think it was
Bounce.
absolutely fantastic.
I do a lot of bouncing around.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.